So these Canadian mining companies benefited from opening up African countries' resource sectors to foreign mining companies, reduced royalty rates, etc. And it was Canadian aid, directly and indirectly through the IMF, that pushed these policies, which ended up being very beneficial to corporate Canada.
I think people have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they're ensnared, but they got to make the effort.
This is Propa-Ganada.
Welcome to Propa-Ganada, where we firmly but politely challenge corporate power in Canada. My guest today is Yves Engler. Yves is an author, investigative journalist, activist, organizer on Canada's left, and he's written extensively on Canadian foreign policy and militarism abroad. Here's our interview. How would you describe how the average Canadian views Canada's role in the world and Canada's foreign policy on the international stage?
Well, there's polls that have shown that Canadians' self-appraisal of their country's foreign policy is as positive as any country in the world. So Canadians generally think Canada is a force for good in the world. Some of these polls are a little bit dated now, and I think over the past decade, some of that mythology and perception has been weakened or dented. But generally, Canadians think Canada is a benevolent international player, and it's very divorced from reality. But there's a sense that I just saw another poll recently that one of the things they asked people about how much influence Canada has, and there was sort of the country was divided about how influential Canada was, but there was a strong support for the idea of Canada being more influential internationally. So Canadians, basically view Canada's role internationally positively. Now, of course, there are significant numbers of people who don't, and there's a significant number of people diverging. But the general polling shows that Canadians think that Canada's well liked around the world.
I was hoping you'd go maybe starting talking about Canada's involvement in the slave trade, and then maybe touching on a few kind of examples in the last century or two, and maybe kind of bring it up and maybe end with kind of the Harper era, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, so from the slave standpoint, I mean, Canada was not a slave plantation economy like Haiti or like the southern U.S., but there were Africans in bondage in Canada, a few hundred. The most significant Canadian contribution to the transatlantic slave trade was the role that the Atlantic provinces played in providing food, cod specifically, to keep people working 16 hours a day in the Caribbean plantations, primarily the British colonies in the Caribbean, but at different periods also Saint-Domingue, which was then a French colony. And basically, there was a lot of wealth that was gained by people in Atlantic provinces sending cod. The good cod was sent to Europe, and the refuse fish, the lesser cod, was sent to the Caribbean. And basically, the plantation owners didn't want to devote, they wanted to only grow cash crops for export. And so they didn't want to devote much land to growing food to feed the slaves, but they needed a source of high protein, cheap source of fuel. And the Atlantic provinces provided that cod for the slave plantations. There's other elements. I mean, Canada was involved in trying to suppress the Haitian Revolution, the great anti-slavery revolution, other forms of support, but that's the most significant one. And in the book, I actually trace wealth of some of the banks that were set up in Nova Scotia, Halifax, which continued to be major banks, CIBC and Scotiabank, some of their wealth to that trade to the Caribbean, enabling the slave process. Going forward, a long history. I mean, Canadians helped in conquering the continent in the late 1800s. A Canadian helped the Belgian king conquer a big chunk of the Congo, the Katanga region, and
Leopold II, right?
King Leopold II, who was considered responsible for as many as 10 million people being killed. William Stairs, who continues to have different, street named after him in Halifax and different sites across the country, helped conquer the Katanga region east of the Congo for King Leopold, and hundreds of other Canadians helped the British conquer different parts of West Africa, primarily a little bit in East Africa. And then there was obviously the two, big missions in Sudan in 1884, 1885, where about 400 Canadians tried to help the British maintain control of Khartoum, and then the better known Boer War in South Africa in the 1899 to 1902. About 7,000 Canadians were dispatched there. There were Canadians who were governors, British colonial governors of northern Nigeria, of Ghana, of Kenya. Canada basically supported European colonialism in Africa right until the end of it, and provided huge amounts of weaponry through the NATO training assistance program in the 1950s, while those, the French, the British, the Belgians were suppressing independence movements in their different African colonies. Canada, and then, in the independence period, probably one of the worst things that Canada did in the independence period was supported the overthrow and assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, the independence leader of the Congo.
So just to interrupt you there. So can you, for those who don't know what Lumumba's what the movement behind him was about, can you maybe explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically about the Belgians were prepared to provide political independence, but they wanted to keep control of the huge resources in the Congo. I mean, in today's terms, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in resources. I think some estimates are even into the trillions of dollars. But at that time, it was already a huge mineral hub. And what Lumumba represented was the nationalistic forces that wanted to genuinely break free from, Belgian grip. And obviously Belgian corporate interests didn't like that too much, that were, exploiting the resources. And they instigated a secessionist movement in the east of the country. And then there was Lumumba called for a UN force to help his nascent government. And there were Canadian troops that the Americans really pushed for Canada to be part of this UN mission. And the Canadian troops worked to undermine Lumumba through the UN mission. And then there's the Canadian colonel who was actually boasted years later about his role in telling Joseph Mobutu, the head of the military, where Lumumba had escaped to. A long, complicated story. And basically, Mobutu's forces with Canadian soldier, part of the process and pushing the process, capture Lumumba, and not long after that, he's killed. So, after the Americans and the Belgians, Canada, I think, was the third major contributor to the downfall of Lumumba. And today, in Africa, Lumumba is widely viewed as this, independence hero, and trying to, move the continent in a, democratic, free of colonial domination kind of direction. There's other examples, more passive Canadian support for the ouster of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, of Milton Obote in Uganda, Canada's role in pushing structural adjustment programs in the 1980s, which devastated the economies of many African countries. And basically what a structural adjustment program, for people who may not be familiar with that, is what, the International Monetary Fund. There was a big global debt crisis where the poor countries ran into big debt payment problems due to a series of factors that didn't have that much to do with their policies. And basically, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the leading capitalist countries took advantage of this debt crisis to push to break down those countries' nationalistic economic policies and push what is widely, what's called neoliberalism today, which is, opening countries up to foreign investors, reducing government control of natural resources, allowing foreign mining companies to come in, often slashing spending on social services, all in the name of paying back this debt. And so the Canadian government really pushed that process, and part of that process was telling governments that if they didn't, if you follow what the International Monetary Fund is saying in terms of privatizing your economy and reducing social spending, then we'll provide you with aid. So it was a way of coaxing different governments into it, and then governments that didn't follow the rules, all of a sudden their aid got cut off, and that put a whole bunch of economic pressure on those governments. And the Canadian government was right at the forefront of pushing that process all across the continent, and not just in Africa, but in some countries in the Western Hemisphere as well. And the primary beneficiaries, or some of the primary beneficiaries of this process, was foreign mining companies. And if you look at Canadian mining investment in Africa, structural adjustment period, there's fairly limited amount of Canadian mining investment, but from like the early 1990s until today, it's just skyrockets. It goes up like 100%. At its high point, it was over $30 billion. And so these Canadian mining companies benefited from opening up African countries' resource sectors to foreign mining companies, reduced royalty rates, etc. And it was Canadian aid, directly and indirectly through the IMF, that pushed these policies, which ended up being very beneficial to corporate Canada.
So, Yves, what would you say to folks who say yes, there's some instances of abuse, but these countries, there's a trickle down effects. There's some wealth. There's the growth of a middle class in some of these countries, and that these countries need to benefit from the technologies to develop their resources, and that eventually maybe if these countries were, if these people worked harder, they'd be able to do this on their own. But in the lack of that, they need us to help with that.
Well, I mean, there's like kernels of truth in that. There's also, just statistical data that shows that's not true. In Africa specifically, there's hundreds of millions more people today than that make under $1.50 a day, $1.50 a day, hundreds of millions more today than there were 25, 30 years ago. So the neoliberal period in Africa has shown there are more people. Partly that's because of population growth, but partly that's also actually even proportion of the population. So statistically, that doesn't really hold. I mean, I've traveled across Tanzania and Kenya, and been to Uganda a couple of times. To the idea that it's a question of like not working hard enough is you don't have to spend much time to see the situation and know that has no correlation to reality. And in fact, and also even from the standpoint of the whole sort of like neoliberal ideology of being more entrepreneurial, the reality is that people in Uganda or Kenya are far more entrepreneurial than people in Canada are, and it's largely wasted. And I tell a story in the Canada and Africa book right at the start of just seeing the level of like entrepreneur busing across Tanzania, and seeing the level of entrepreneurial spirit in terms of selling stuff to people on buses. It's incredibly inefficient is what it is. And it's partly something that's pushed on Tanzanians because so much of the wealth of that country has been extracted, and they haven't developed internal markets, internal manufacturing, internal production. So economic policies that are designed to serve Tanzanians. Because of that, the whole economic reality for people is they need to hustle in a very inefficient way from a big picture perspective, and hustle to make $2 or $3 a day. So from a workload perspective, it's far more intense than what the vast majority of Canadians do, and from an entrepreneurial perspective, it's way more dynamic and creative than what most Canadians do. It's highly inefficient. There's lots and lots of elements to explain it. I can't, I'm not saying there's just one factor. It's just because of structural adjustment, or it's just because of colonialism that explains it. But those are important factors in understanding the impoverishment and whatnot.
So now, can you talk a little bit about some of the bigger players in terms of the mining companies, Barrick Gold, some of the other big ones that can you kind of talk about their agenda and some of the way that their power influences our foreign policy?
Well, their agenda is pretty straightforward. I mean, their agenda is to profit, right, and to extract as much profit as possible. What they're willing to do to extract that profit is I would say it varies a little bit, based upon, there are some companies that are particularly immoral, but I think the broad outlines is pretty straightforward. They're all trying to basically do the same thing. The circumstances of where they're operating varies, and then they get to the really important question, which is how influential they are in determining Canadian government policy. And they are, in some instances, quite influential. In a macro sense, they are very influential. I mean, like the industry, Canadian foreign policy in different African countries, the primary thing, it's not in every country, it varies a little bit, but the primary thing that's going on is the Canadian diplomatic apparatus is trying to advance Canadian economic interests. And in most African countries, the primary Canadian economic interest is in the extraction realm. There's elements of that are not open, but many elements are just totally open. I mean, the Trade Commissioner Service, which is I think about 1,500 Global Affairs Canada employees, that's their whole raison d'être. I mean, they don't hide it. That the objective is to have economic benefits for Canadian companies.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to the Canadian ambassador or high commissioner, the pretense is a little bit more broad than just help corporate Canada, or even for that matter for the aid, right? The aid, a big chunk of what Canadian aid does is help Canadian companies. So I mean, the structure of Global Affairs Canada and the whole diplomatic apparatus is to advance Canada's national interest, and that is heavily defined as the interests of corporations, mining corporations, particularly in Africa. And there's many examples. I mean, to take one, we're talking about Tanzania, and Barrick. You mentioned Barrick Gold. Well, Barrick Gold's probably the most influential. Historically, it is clearly the most influential Canadian mining company over the past 15 years, and specifically with regards to foreign policy, because the founder of Barrick Gold, Peter Monk, set up the most influential global affairs university program at the Monk School of Global Affairs at University of Toronto. So they have a particular influence over Canadian foreign policy that we can get into if you want. But more concretely in Tanzania, Barrick Gold is a major player. It's been extracting billions of dollars worth of resources from Tanzania over the past last 2 decades or so, and it's been involved in huge conflicts. Its North Mara mine has I think the low estimate is about 24 people, and then the high estimate is into getting towards 100, but 60, 70 people who've been killed at the mine site over the past I think since about 2006. And this has been reported on in the business section of the Global Mail. It's been reported on by the Tanzanian government. This is not some hidden source. And in 2017, they were in a big conflict with the Tanzanian government, not primarily over the human rights violations of its mine, but over the fact that it wasn't, according to the Tanzanian government, paying even close to its proper royalty rates. It was basically evading Tanzanian taxes. And it's a big, huge conflict in Tanzania, like front page news in Tanzania over weeks and weeks, this conflict. And the new president was really putting the screws to Barrick Gold and saying, you got to pay up. And there was a big, huge negotiation going on between Barrick's subsidiary and the Tanzanian government. And at the time, the Canadian High Commissioner in Tanzania organized a meeting between Barrick, the head of Barrick, and the president of Tanzania. And immediately after the meeting, he says that Barrick Gold, sort of celebrates Barrick Gold as it follows Canadian standards of corporate social responsibility. Well, Barrick Gold is a highly controversial company all around the world. All kinds of conflicts, from Papua New Guinea to Chile, Dominican Republic, all kinds of major conflicts with Barrick Gold. It's been cited in all kinds of lists of some of the worst corporations in the world over the years. And this is in the country where they are responsible for their worst abuses. Literally, we're talking about 50 plus people killed by their security forces or police paid by Barrick at one of their mines in Tanzania. At the same time, they have a huge conflict over unpaid royalties and taxes. And here you have the Canadian High Commissioner giving the full stamp of approval of Canada to this company and saying, this is Canadian standards of corporate responsibility. We back this company up. So basically, if you can back up Barrick Gold in that context, you can defend any Canadian mining company in any context, because it doesn't get any worse than that.
But just sorry to interrupt you, Yves, but just as a side note, just to add in, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney he sat on the board of directors of Barrick Gold, and George Bush Sr. was on the board of directors. So that itself shows the connection, right, with the higher levels of political power. Exactly, they're incredibly powerful corporation. I mentioned, Peter Monk.
He set up the most influential. He funded and shaped the most influential school of global affairs in this country. The Monk debates, right? The Globe and Mail, the most influential newspaper in the country, has a whole partnership with the Monk debates, where they publish op-eds, and they from the Monk debates. There's a formal partnership between the Globe and Mail and this charity set up by Peter Monk. Peter Monk's on record of being backing Augusto Pinochet in Chile, notorious dictator in Chile, and comparing Hugo Chavez to Hitler. So he has clear right-wing politics. He's hostile to any government that tries to gain greater share of the wealth from natural resources. And it's a very powerful company, well connected politically. And so the Canadian government goes to bat for Barrick, no matter the context. But this is one of the most well documented examples. But that's what's happening on a day-to-day basis all across the African continent, and also in Latin America and elsewhere, where Canadian diplomats are working to help at the least political level. They are working to help Canadian mining companies, get to know people in the right ministries of, let's just say, the Ecuadorian government or the government of Burkina Faso. And then at the most political or the most immoral level, they are running cover for companies that are responsible for killing people and ecological damage and etc.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of now we're turning towards Latin America a little bit. I'm actually going to skip Stephen Harper. Okay, I want to get to Trudeau, and I want you to talk about the style versus substance with Trudeau in terms of the way he presents, the way his government has presented Canada's role on the world stage, and the actual foreign policies that they've kind of been implementing. And maybe you could focus kind of like on Venezuela, Latin America, or whatever areas you want to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say, I mean, I did a book called The Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy. And then I just published a book called, which I initially, the working title was The Ugly Canadian 2, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. The publisher suggested a different title. Ultimately, it was called The House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy.
Because he's so pretty. He's so pretty.
But so basically, the continuation between the policy of Harper and the policy of Trudeau, there's a whole lot more that's the same in terms of policy than is different. There is a different branding and rhetorical element. The two main sort of branding exercises for Trudeau's foreign policy is the international rules-based order and then the feminist foreign policy. Those are the two kind of liberalish, sort of progressive sounding elements to their foreign policy rhetoric. They absolutely collapse upon inspection. And, you know, in the House of Mirrors, I provide, example after example after example of how they, you know, they don't fulfill their feminist stated feminist objectives. I mean, there's around the edges in their feminist international assistance policy. I think there's some positives that are that the you know, focusing aid on gender specific initiatives. There's some, you know, positives around the edges. But the thrust of the policy is completely inconsistent with anything approaching genuine feminism. And I mean, the examples are kind of endless. You know, in terms of Venezuela, the Trudeau government has been involved in a completely brazen effort over the past 2 years to oust the president, Nicolas Maduro, who, you know, you can find all kinds of legitimate criticisms of, but when you get down to it, Nicolas Maduro's electoral legitimacy is stronger than you know, Donald Trump's, and far stronger than many of the governments that Canada has aligned with in the Lima Group, which is an organization that Canada helped set up with Peru, with the Peruvian government, to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And a whole bunch of our allies in the Lima Group are their legitimacy is, electoral legitimacy is almost non-existent, and their, you know, human rights violations are infinitely worse than the Venezuelan governments. And so, you know, what is Canada's campaign? Canada's campaign is officially recognizing this opposition, marginal opposition politician, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate president. That's now been a total failure. 2 years now since that process began, and Guaido has no formal power within the Venezuelan government. He was just happened to be the head of the National Assembly because there was an alliance between opposition parties where they were rotating the presidency of the National Assembly. So the only reason he even got into that position was because his party happened to be next in rotation. And Canada has supported opposition groups, financed different opposition groups. This been going on for a number of years.
Yeah.
They have.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but just to kind of drive home the fact that these are opposition groups to governments that want to take resources from the country and use it somewhat for social programs, literacy, public housing, education, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, I mean, I'm just kind of repeating this, but that's the common pattern, right? It's not, just
in the case of the Venezuelan government, it's absolutely clear. And more generally, the hostility to the Venezuelan government by Ottawa and by Washington is not based upon were the elections 100% perfect, not based upon is there violence or human rights violations in the country. It's because it's a government that follows policies that we do not like. And when I say we, I mean the decision makers in Ottawa and Washington. And the policies they don't like is, nationalizing or renationalizing the oil sector, is big conflict between some Canadian mining companies, gold mining companies, and the Venezuelan government. Canadian Bank, not happy with the Venezuelan government. And the economic situation in Venezuela now has turned into a disaster, mostly because of foreign sanctions and a whole campaign to basically punish the population to the point where they'll force the government out. But the policies that were pursued were designed to take more of the wealth that was going into the hands of transnational corporations and the Venezuelan elite, and put those resources into literacy programs, education, cooperatives, etc. There were very important social projects that empowered the poor. The reason why, despite the incredible resources and effort that primarily Washington, with Canada alongside it, have put into trying to oust Nicolas Maduro, the reason why, and this worsening economic situation, the reason why the population, a substantial share of the population, is still behind the government is because this has been a government over the past 20 years, beginning with Hugo Chavez, that has put a unique amount of effort into bettering the plight of the excluded, of the impoverished. And I mean, you can debate all kinds of points about, did the government do this right? Is it, should they not have done that, or too repressive there, or this or that? The basic point is poor Venezuelans, and still, again, despite incredible economic downturn, mostly because of vicious American-led sanctions. The reason they maintain backing for the government is because this is a government that has been good to them, and they still have fond, positive memories. Additionally, is that there's people have self-respect, and they're like, well, maybe we're going to be poorer because of these sanctions and this campaign, but we are not going to cave to imperialism. We're not going to cave to Washington deciding who gets what, and to punish whoever. And the reality is that the Canadian government today and historically, but in the case of Venezuela in recent years, in a very, very aggressive form, has aligned with the punishers in Washington, the government that has traditionally said, who's acceptable and who's not acceptable, and has reinforced the reactionary elites in countries all across the hemisphere. And today, the Canadian government is, aggressively aligned, and the Trudeau government is doing it, and they do it under the grounds of this lofty rhetoric. But again, when you delve into it, when they say that, they're talking about democracy, and then the Lima group to overthrow the Venezuelan government includes a president in Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, whose constitutional legitimacy is basically nil, right? I mean, the Honduran constitution says you can't have second term. President's only one term. He gets the Supreme Court to get rid of that. And then when he's losing the vote by 5 percentage points, all of a sudden voting stops for 24 hours. And when it gets back on, all of a sudden Juan Orlando Hernandez is in the lead. That's one of our allies in the Lima group. Another ally in the Lima group is the Colombian government that has worked to sabotage this historic peace agreement with the FARC rebels, and has now, which has led to just a further expansion of the already disastrous human rights situation in Honduras or in Colombia, where social movement, indigenous leaders get killed. I mean, according to the UN, it's like 106 last year, and then another close to 100 former FARC guerrillas who demobilized, and about another 100 been killed, and the numbers even worse this year. That's another major ally in this campaign. So it doesn't just
complete inconsistency, right? It's
blatant, and it takes like, if we didn't have a media that was so organized around repeating what the powerful and what Ottawa and Washington want us to hear, it would all just kind of collapse in a few minutes. But the media's sphere is so oriented towards what the decision makers want that the vast majority of the population have sort of no idea what's going on.
Can you talk a bit more about DND and about how the consent is manufactured in Canada for us to be okay with their kind of a more militaristic role internationally? And I know it's a big question, so maybe I'll just start you off. Can you talk a little bit more about academia? Start at academia, and then we'll move on to like corporate media.
Yeah, I mean, there's many elements. Okay, in academia, you have the military has run for the past, I guess, almost 50 years now, has run it's had differing names over the years, program to set up security studies programs at university departments across the country. I think at the high point, it was something more than 15 different security studies programs were established with DND funding or were dependent upon Department of National Defense funding, and obviously that shapes the outlook of what gets studied, and it's not just a matter of academics just orienting their worldview towards D&D. I mean, I think some of that does happen, but mostly it's a matter of, if you're a budding academic and you write things in security studies that are viewed favorably by the military, your prospects for employment or your prospects of getting access to research funding are better. Beyond that process, the Department of National Defense runs a major history department. And in the book, The Propaganda System, How Canada's Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation, which is the name of my 2016 book on the matter, I show how a number of the most influential academics on Canadian military history, they began as official historians of the Canadian military. So they were paid historians of the Department of National Defense, and they became for in the early and into like the 1970s, 1980s, they were like far and away the most you could connect like the whole thrust of the most influential military historians to being former employees, historians of the Canadian military. So, and then you get into like journals that are military publishes journals, and then it goes even broader with funding more broadly from military companies on academia, and that tends to be a little bit more indirect. But the influence of D&D on academia is and specifically on kind of security studies and Canadian military history is substantial.
So let's say, what do you say to people who acknowledge that corporate media is owned by these big shots, but it doesn't really necessarily come down to the editorial level? They're the owners, but journalism is still very free. In Canada, there's no police coming and arresting journalists. So what do you say to people that say, okay, there's corporate media is not necessarily beholden to those interests?
Well, I would say that's kind of madness. I mean, to think that the ownership of a media outlet would not have an effect on the content. I mean, would you believe that in any other sector, right? Like the owner of McDonald's ideology is not going to translate down. Obviously, there's an effect. You can debate how big of an effect, but it goes way beyond ownership. I mean, in the book, Propaganda System, I put forward a number of documented examples where the ownership of news outlets intervened in the editorial process directly to push a foreign policy perspective. The former owner of La Presse, or continued owner, I believe, the Desmarais family with regards to China, the Aspers with regards to Israel. That's probably the best documented example. Previous one, the Ottawa Citizen, with regards to Canada's role on, I believe, if I remember correctly, it was on Canada sending troops to Germany in the 1960s. So there's examples of owners directly intervening on foreign policy issues. I think that plays a very small role in the more general effect of the ownership on the editorial line, but going beyond ownership, I mean, another part of it is advertisers, right? And advertising is a major source of the income for most media outlets, and I provide some examples of advertisers' interests and foreign policy perspective. Another very important part is who's producing content. And this one, I think, is we were talking about the Department of National Defense and their influence over academia. The Department of National Defense, the Canadian military, is the biggest public relations entity in the country. Right? There are hundreds and hundreds. It's not clear exactly how many, but one estimate I put forward in the book is 650 people who are full-time employees of the Canadian military or DND who are engaged in PR work. I mean, that's an incredible number of individuals, and their basic objective is to get the outlook of the military into major media outlets, and so that's a very important effect on the whole media sphere. And if you compare that to like the peace movement or the anti-war movement, how many people are full-time employees for peace organizations in this country? PR employees period, let alone PR employees. And it's like employees period is probably, I don't know, 10, 20 maximum, and that are just about public relations is probably one or two or maybe even none. So on one side, you have this military has a huge public relations apparatus to reach out to journalists, to produce copy, to organize events that are amenable to being covered by the media. And on the other side, it's all volunteers, right? And that's just the military. That doesn't even get into all the arms manufacturers and other associated bodies, Veterans Affairs and the Canadian Legion, which is and or other think tanks that are funded by arms companies, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously that's all going to have an impact on what appears in the media, and I completely agree that we live in a relatively free media sphere in terms of there's not somebody chucking you in jail if you step out of line, but there's all kinds of ways in which people get filtered out. Journalists who are into challenging military or powerful players, they basically get filtered out. They don't get to rise to positions where they get the flexibility or the independence to, cover important issues. That's not saying there aren't any. Someone like
Yep.
David Puglisi at the Ottawa Citizen, who's probably the best military reporter in the country. He's somebody who does actually, produce some critical stuff about the military. But if you actually look at, a little bit more deeply about how Puglisi covers these issues, he maintains a very sort of like the Canadian military is a force for good and essentially benevolent entity, while providing all kinds of critical information.
Well, I guess it's the narrative of Canada as peacekeeping nation is so ingrained into our collective identity that we can become aware of all of these examples to the contrary, but they remain the exceptions that defines the rule or whatever, right? And I just going back to the fact that journalism seems pretty free in this country. In a way, it could be like in a country where there's blatant censorship. People, the people kind of know that when they see things on TV that it's kind of bullshit, right? And in one maybe pernicious aspect is that we're more trusting of CBC. We're more trusting because we have this free kind of more free press, as it were. What do you think about that?
Well, one thing on that. So you say that the intensity of the mythology is so strong, right? So in the very good investigation by master's student Isabel McDonald of Canada, the Canadian media's response to the 2004 coup in Haiti, where Canada played a very important role in overthrowing the elected government. She interviews Neil MacDonald from the CBC, and Neil MacDonald tells her explicitly that Canada sent troops and played all kinds of role in destabilizing the elected government, and then ultimately supports this imposed government that kills, responsible for thousands of people being killed. And Neil MacDonald basically says he gets sent down to cover the coup, and he tells her what you're saying about Canada's role doesn't fit what I don't believe that Canada would just back a small light-skinned the 10 families that run Haiti and would be basically would seek to further impoverish the poor. Sue Montgomery, a journalist that the Montreal Gazette sent down at the time of the coup, she told basically the same thing to me. That it just goes against their whole perception of how Canada operates in the world, even if the facts actually were completely aligned in that direction. Sue Montgomery ultimately does this turnaround, 180-degree turn within a 2-year period, where she believes that the politicians who were responsible for the coup in Haiti, that they should be voted out because they contributed to this coup in Haiti. So she actually provides an example of how the media is not. There is some room for, there's some openness and there's ability to influence from outside groups to influence what appears. I mean, when I say outside groups, I mean activist groups. But yeah, the overriding ideology is so strong, and you're right that when the perception is that we have a free media, the impact that has on the population willing to go along with what the government's doing is greater. One example of this so-called free media, I provide a whole bunch of them in the propaganda system, but in 2010 there was a terrible earthquake in Haiti. Canada decided to send a couple thousand troops instead of sending heavy urban search and rescue teams that are based at Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, across the country. And at the time, I've been involved in a lot of Haiti solidarity work. I said that, and other people in the Canada-Haiti Action Network were saying that, why are you militarizing a disaster? This is political. You are focusing on security over helping people. There was also about 10,000 American troops that were sent at the same time. Mm-hmm. we were saying this at the time, just after the January 2010 earthquake. And a year later, the Canadian press reported on accessed information file that showed exactly what we were saying. They found the internal government document that said they were concerned about a power vacuum, and that Aristide, the president that we helped overthrow in 2004, that he, who was then in exile in South Africa, that he might use the post-earthquake period to return to Haiti. And so we sent troops. So it's just horrible, horrible human suffering. And they prioritized dominating Haiti over the situation. This was, so the Canadian press reports on this. They have the internal government document, and I did a Canadian newsstand search. The only newspaper in the country that published it was the Kamloops Daily News.
Oh,
So
they're a heavy hitter. Yeah.
And almost every newspaper has the Canadian press wire service, but somehow the editor of the Kamloops paper didn't get the memo that this is not something to actually appear in the paper. A couple of outlets put it on their website. So this is the level of, like, it's so deeply held that you know, you don't want to embarrass Canada, you don't embarrass Canadian foreign policy. So you know, this is the free press that we have, and this is one example, one extreme example. There are many examples. Unless there are sources of power pushing a different perspective, or more specifically, you know, activist groups and social movements pushing a different perspective, the natural state of the media is to just run what powerful people would prefer to have. And I'm going to say the bias in favor of power exists all across the spectrum and all the different issues in the media. On foreign policy issues, it's much worse than when it comes to the minimum wage or healthcare or other domestic issues.
It seems like Canadians are particularly checked out of any kind of involvement in foreign policy discussions, and I think barely. I mean, I can't remember in national debates for during elections. I can't remember any real questions about foreign policy, or if not, it's very self-congratulatory. If the population is not engaged on any issue, then it's just going to be the powerful forces that have direct self-interest that are going to shape the whole discussion. And again, that's the case with all different political issues. But because there's so much less engagement from population who are generally disinterested, you know, don't have direct major stakes, then that's who dominates. But I actually, unfortunately, Jacob, I actually kind of got to go. I'm getting called repeatedly from my mom. Okay, that's a good enough reason. Yves, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, and I hope to talk to you in the future.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
All right, take care. Yeah.